After uncovering one of the most intricate and groundbreaking criminal networks this country has ever seen, Danny Caselaro gears up to break the news to the public. But of course, before he has the opportunity to do so, he dies in a hotel room in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Prior to his death, only a handful of people knew who Danny was, and even fewer knew what he was doing. Perhaps if they did, they would have told him to stop. Why? Well, because it seems as though prior to his death, Danny had dedicated his entire life to unraveling the web, connecting the highest levels of government to the most manipulative forms of criminal activity. A dangerous feat considering the amount of people in high places who wouldn't think twice about shutting Danny down the moment they got even the slightest inkling that his work in investigative journalism might actually lead to the public realizing the government's involvement in, and the distinct connections between, the Inslaw Case, the October surprise, Iran-Contra, and the collapse of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Let's break it down. The Inslaw Case, a company and an inventor's public fight for ownership over illegal spy software. Yep, you heard me. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, while working for the US Justice Department, a man named William A. Hamilton developed a program called PROMIS, short for Prosecutors Management Information System. The program was originally designed to organize paperwork generated by law enforcement and the courts, but apparently with just a few tweaks, PROMIS became so much more. In 1983, Hamilton left the department and claimed they stole the software from him. They claimed that because he developed it while working for the department, they owned it. A legal battle then ensued that lasted until 1991. Surprise, surprise, the department won. Enter Michael Riconoscuto, an American electronics and computer expert who informed Hamilton that the department had inserted backdoors into the program software that allowed them to spy on whoever purchased the PROMIS program. After that, Riconoscuto was arrested and labeled a rogue scientist, weapons designer, platinum miner, and illegal substance manufacturer, but not before revealing a few more government secrets. Among them was the Iran-Contra Affair, a political scandal that took place between 1981 and 1986 during the second term of the Reagan administration. For 5 years, the United States senior administration officials facilitated the illegal sale of weapons to Iran, despite the fact that Iran was, at the time, subject to an arms embargo, meaning they weren't allowed to do that. The money made off of the illegal sales were then used to illegally fund the Contras, US-backed and funded right-winged rebel groups who opposed the Sandinista National Liberal Front, a Nicaraguan socialist political party. Seeing as both the sales of weapons to Iran and the funding of the Contras were prohibited under Congress, the administration needed to come up with some kind of excuse as to why they had been supplying Iran with arms for a total of 6 years during an embargo, and they did. The administration claimed that the sales were part of a hostage negotiation with an Iranian terror group. Of course, there was never any evidence that that was the case. In fact, in 1986, President Reagan actually flat out stated that the US did not trade arms in exchange for hostages. Of course, in 1987, after a whole bunch of documents related to the incident either went missing or were destroyed, the president released a new statement saying that the administration had in fact traded weapons for hostages. Right. And then of course there is the 1980 October surprise theory that states that the Reagan administration purposefully delayed the release of American hostages in October so that they could undermine President Jimmy Carter and win the upcoming November election. According to the theory, Ronald Reagan's team made a secret deal with the Iranian leaders to wait to release the 66 Americans they had been holding hostage for the past year until Reagan was elected president so that he could take credit for negotiating their release instead of Carter. In exchange, Iran would receive $40 million. Whether or not this is true is highly debated, but seeing as the day of Reagan's inauguration the hostages were released, and then of course Reagan's administration went on to illegally supply Iran with weapons for the next 6 years, I would say there was a fair bit of quid pro quo going on between the two. And then there's the collapse of the BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, that was in cahoots with a former US president and used shell companies, fake foundations, foundations and fake real estate to launder billions of dollars in and out of the country. The bank operated in the late 1970s as a non-Western alternative for small-scale deposits across the globe. It operated in over 70 countries, including the US, Switzerland, France, and the United Kingdom, and with $20 billion in assets, equal to $50 billion in today's money by the mid-1980s, it was on track to become one of the world's largest banks by the year 2000, which would be great if the whole thing wasn't actually a Ponzi scheme designed to launder money for dictator families and criminal organizations across the globe. When this information started to come out, the bank knew it had to act fast to maintain its homely image and suppress investigations, and so it began funding presidential campaigns in an attempt to influence politicians and lawmakers. Eventually, however, the bank collapsed, and when it did, it became clear to the public that it had committed the largest bank fraud in world financial history. Not only that, but money laundering tactics created by the BCCI are still used today for illegal money laundering. After learning about the interconnected web of international crimes and their connections to global leaders, Danny knew something had to be done. He wanted the world to know what he now believed he knew, that the world's most prominent leaders are working together at the expense of the masses in order to achieve financial gain. Danny's research into the conspiracy began in 1990, and by 1991 he had met enough people and gathered enough research to pitch his first book on the subject. He called it The Octopus because he saw it as the perfect metaphor for all of the branching tentacles of corruption spanning across the globe. Of course, his book was denied by publishers, and I mean, who could blame them? Publishing a book like that would essentially be co-signing your own death sentence. But Danny was determined. He kept pushing for the discovery and the publication of information related to global corruption, and then one day, Danny died. On the morning of August 10th, 1991, cleaning staff at the Sheridan Inn in Martinsburg, West Virginia, entered Danny's hotel room to find a most gruesome scene. Danny was dead in his bathtub. His wrists had been cut and there was BLOOD everywhere. It didn't take long for authorities to rule Danny's death self-inflicted. I mean, there were no signs of struggle and no evidence of anyone else having been in the room. Plus, there was a note that read, "To those who I love most, please forgive me for the worst possible thing I could have done. Most of all, I am sorry to my son. I know deep down inside, God will let me in." While under any other circumstances this would be an open and shut case, the nature of Danny's life and death meant that things just weren't adding up. First of all, there's the fact that in the weeks leading up to Danny's death, he had received numerous anonymous threatening phone calls, many of which were witnessed by his housekeeper threatening his life. One person who called Danny even said that if Danny continued with his investigation, they would cut him up and throw him to the sharks. And then there's the fact that prior to heading down to West Virginia, where Danny had planned to meet a source, he told his brother that if anything were to happen to him, it most certainly would not have been an accident. And then there's the fact that his housekeeper saw him take a briefcase filled to the brim with documents relating to the Octopus conspiracy. Yet somehow, none of those documents were ever recovered, neither in his car nor his hotel room. And there's also the note. Now, I'm not one to judge, but myself and many others agree that for a writer, his last goodbye was suspiciously short. You know what else was short? The amount of time it took for authorities to declare the case closed. Just 4 days after Danny's death, his body had been embalmed, his hotel room had been wiped clean, and his case had been shut. All before his family had ever even been informed about his passing. And even FBI agents questioned the ruling of local authorities, but their concerns were, of course, quickly pushed aside by their superiors at the agency. Many people wondered if perhaps there was some kind of mafia link to Casolaro's death, or if the CIA had possibly been hired to clean up his hotel room in order to cover up any kind of crime that might have been committed there. These theories were only further cemented by the fact that Danny's family was denied the right to conduct an independent investigation of his death. Not to mention, it was shortly after his death that the Inslaw case was officially closed. And of course, there's the fact that during Danny's funeral, a military officer who had arrived in a limo that no one knew was seen placing a medal onto Danny's coffin and then quickly leaving without ever saying a word to his family or anyone else in attendance. As I said, things about this case just really don't add up. So, if Danny's wounds weren't self-inflicted, and his death was in fact at the hands of another, 3 questions are automatically raised. Who why, and how. On August 9th, the day before Danny's death, he met with a man named William Turner. Turner handed Danny some documents, and the two had a quick conversation before going their separate ways. After that, Danny briefly met up with an unknown man who appeared to be either Arabian or Iranian at the Sheraton. Later, he encountered Mike Looney, who had been staying in the room next to Danny's. Danny told Mike that he was in town to meet with a source that would be providing him with information that would support his research. Unfortunately, however, during his talk with Looney, Danny's source called to cancel their meeting. Danny and Looney then talked until 9:30, and Danny was last seen getting coffee at a nearby store at 10 p.m. But according to witnesses, Looney was not the last man to speak to Danny. Joseph Cooler, an expert on psychological warfare, known for getting information by infiltrating and manipulating his targets, was actually the last person to see Danny alive. While there is currently no way of knowing, it is possible that Joseph Cooler either directly or indirectly caused the death of Danny Casolaro, likely to protect the secrets of the true one-world government run by the global elite. Guys, there is so much more that I could say about this subject. It really is quite fascinating. There is a documentary on Netflix that you can check out if you'd like. For now, I've been your host, Hannah Thompson, and I'll see you in the next video.